So now we would like to come back to the Asia Pacific. We have invited 3 discussants, and because of the time constraint, we are having 8 minutes from each of them. But then they have been very much already in the process of the South-South forums. And first, I would like to invite Professor Katherine Gibson. We were very privileged with her coming to be with us last year and showing us the film she made and giving lectures. So for all these recorded proceedings, please go to the library section of the Global University website, and you can see all our previous recordings and also the lectures given by Professor Gibson. So Professor Gibson is an economic geographer with an international reputation for innovative research on economic transformation, and she has had over 30 years experience of working with communities to build resilient economies. And with Gibson, and as J.K. Gibson Granham, she is currently co-editing the Handbook of Diverse Economies. So thank you, Katherine. Can we now over to you?
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kinchi. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's a great privilege to be here speaking in the South-South Forum, and I wish I could be here with you in Hong Kong. It's just wonderful to be connected to people across the world through this medium, coming from the South, not the global South in my case, but from the South, speaking together. I've got a big charter here to try and listen from so many talks, but first I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Sydney, but I'm speaking to you from the stolen lands of the Gadigal, Daraja and Darawal people, who are the Indigenous owners of this region. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise that I'm talking to you from unceded land. And I guess that originally that puts me in the context of a story of globalization, in which my own privilege, white privilege, has been based upon the extinction of land rights for many Indigenous people in Australia, and also my own personal family privilege has been based on the labour of indentured and enslaved Pacific Island labourers who are brought to this country as sugar plantation workers. And I guess, the last few months in Australia have been very challenging, as they have been all over the world, but we started the year with a number of months of landscape-wide bushfires that totally obliterated the eastern forests of our country and sent smoke plumes up into the world, up into the atmosphere that I think were then breathed in New Zealand, in Chile, and then came right around to Western Australia. So again, we have experienced the ecological apocalypse that Professor CECEñA has talked about in our own lives in these recent months. On top of that has been COVID, which we're dealing with reasonably well, but is still managing to stop the economy and produce a pause that I think many people around the world have said, let's look at this pausing of the economy and say, what can we do with it? How can we move forward after this, not just bounce back? And of course, we've also been very affected by the Black Lives Matter movement that erupted in the US, but has spilled over into Australia in the very week that one of the major transnational mining companies, Rio Tinto, exploded as part of its mining operations in Western Australia. 42,000-year-old cave with incredible artefacts from Indigenous occupants in this country. So again, that territoriality of power of the transnational was something that then activated, of course, also deaths in custody of Indigenous people, activated a whole movement in Australia in solidarity with Black Lives. And I might come back to those 3 interconnected things at the end, but let me just quickly mention some of the wonderful interventions that you've all made on this panel. I think what we've heard is visions of a different kind of globalization, perhaps, not necessarily deglobalization. We've seen that globalization doesn't necessarily have to be oppressive. From Professor JOMO, there are ways of doing trade, of doing connection and mobility in ways that aren't necessarily oppressive. And I guess I'm interested in his point of view of whether we can have a globalized form of degrowth, because so much of the globalization, economic globalization argument is so tied in still to economic growth. When we come to Professor MUSHAKOJI, his wonderful kind of vision of two different internationals in which the Silk Road becomes a promise of a different kind of economy. But again, I wonder to what extent growth is part of that vision, that Belt and Road vision that's being put forward. And my film last year that I showed on the Bamboo Bridge, a wonderful bridge over the Mekong River that has fallen prey to the development of another concrete bridge that is part of the Belt and Way, I think shows the way in which a certain kind of economic growth is really suppressing many of the forms of resilience that may be along the way of that road. And I wonder to what extent the bazaar economy that you're talking about, what are the ethics of the bazaar economy? To what extent that growth is still part of them? Or does the evil eye of the bazaar economy control growth and make it an equitable kind of vision of economy? I'm interested in that perspective. Professor HUANG, I thought it was very interesting the way in which you brought up the idea of new identities needing to be developed, new forms of solidarity, and that the UN isn't a kind of the institution that's going to be able to help us deal with these incredible threats that we're facing. And I think the theme of new identities was something that a number of speakers brought up. Dr. FARID, I love the idea of talking about the senile dynasties. I guess this kind of articulates that notion that Arundhati Roy has put forward, that we're in a moment of pause where we can start to look at what's around us and start to think of a different way forward out of this old dying kind of world that can't possibly be reconstructed at the moment. And so the way in which you turn to keselamatan and food and health as an insight into where we need to be working, I think again has resonance with things that other people have said. I thought the way in which you brought it back to rural sustainable development is something that's very key to the South-South Forum, particularly with Professor Wen's involvement over many years with the rural reconstruction movement. And I'd love to hear more about how we might use this kind of intervention around rural sustainability, moving away from what we've thought at the past was ideal but impossible, now to what is actually real and possible, and that some of the initiatives of rural reconstruction might be things that we base a different kind of globalization upon, which of course picks up on the point that Professor MANJI brought out about the globalization of small farmers through the peasant movement and so on. I know I've got only a few seconds, so two last speakers, Professor CECEñA, I just was so appreciative of the fact that you brought the Anthropocene into the picture, the whole ecological crisis that's so embedded in the issues we're dealing with, and of course are embedded, as Professor MANJI brought up, in the idea that the way in which we're farming is also implicated in the zoonotic kind of viruses that we're now suffering. So this question of rurality, of food, of food production, and the virus, and the possibility that the continued industrial agricultural system will create more of these viruses, is an incredibly important point. So the idea of these supremacist zones being kind of becoming more dominant, I think, is a fascinating one. But all of us that are, or not many of us, are in these sacrifice zones where our forests are being sacrificed, our atmospheres are being sacrificed. And that brings me back to what connects, I think, the three movements that have shaped our lives in Australia at least, but all over the world. During the bushfires in Sydney, we couldn't breathe. People had to get masks and ventilators and air purifiers to be able to breathe. With COVID, we can't breathe. Our respiration system is affected. And as we saw the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd was suppressed and he couldn't breathe. And I think the way in which we as a global world population as a whole, we need to acknowledge that we need to be able to breathe. This is something that brings us together. And I guess some inspiration from the fact that in the past, we have been able to work as a global community around addressing the ozone hole, and the Montreal Protocol was one way that people all over the world, from unionists to people in cities, people all over the place, managed to bring together a conception of care for our atmosphere. And I think it's that kind of care that we need to put at the center of the kind of globalization we'd like to see continue. And it has to be, I think, a globalization that questions growth in many ways and questions how we go forward. So, and I'm very much interested as someone who works with community economies on the ground of addressing that and creating more connections between people to people around the global south and, of course, all over the world. So thank you for your wonderful comments, and I look forward to more conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gibson. So now we will move from Australia to Thailand, and I would like to invite Professor Surichai Wongao to speak.
It is my happiness to see all of you here. I have been extremely excited to join this meeting. The feeling I have got, apart from my excitement, is the feeling of really we are sharing a very common issues, and the solidarity that we have brought us to bring us to discuss how this sense or the sense making of what are happening around us can also make us understand how to be a human, in this context of very negative, exploitative relationship with the very context we are living, be biodiversity and not only human but others. So I am very honored to be joining with all of you. I will just say it from Thailand, and just to my point is that the sense making of the issues around us, the real world around us, is one issue, and the other issue is how we realize from all the wonderful speeches and discussions so far have brought us to understand the power of identity and how to overcome it by our interactions. And for that, my last point relates to what we could hope for moving ahead together. So in the first point, it has been very inspiring listening to MUSHAKOJI sensei and with his very paranormal and also very in-depth understanding of the world. And for me also to listen to JOMO and our colleagues from Mexico and CECEñA and FARID from our region. So all this make us feel that we don't have a very distant. We are living in a very specific age where our sense making in this discussion, although we are very far apart physically, but my feeling make me feel humbled enough that we are living now and being to listen to each other. All the more, we also have to feel the sense of loss and sadness when JOMO mentioned about Martin Kor and our friends, Park Kwan-soon, who also this kind of human feeling make me really humbled that we also are inspiring each other to be deeper in our sense making, and also to look back as much as possible how long we can imagine, understand the context we are living. So the sense making issue is really important, whatever disciplines, whatever countries we are from, but it remains for us to ask ourselves what is to be human living in this era where the situation is even in many ways even more difficult. I was struck by the Anthropocene discussion. But may I mention the issue of this in the sense of the power, the context of the power, the issue of power, how human can relate to the issue of power in the world of exploitative, and even in Thailand now. We talk only about Thailand, how Thailand has been dealing somewhat okay along the line of COVID-19. The identity of the power of identity of being someone in one country dominates the feeling that we in fact we are not very good in dealing with the stateless and the non-Thai working people in our own geography. So even along that line, even the Thais, if we want to be so, cannot easily return even from the southern part of Thailand, who then need to come back to Thailand from Malaysia because they are culturally their brothers and sisters at the border in the south. They are not easily accessible to come back because of the quarantine, because of all this, and if the public do not bring this issue up on the front, the issue of how should we be proud of our success dominates the sense of this. So the power of identity of I would say, is real, and it is easy to be captured by the nationalists. There, I think the issue that we really need to reflect together, the importance of talking to each other in terms of national citizens, or human member of nation state. And I would like really to go beyond to see that the COVID-19 sense of solidarity, and to push it to the level of imagination, and also how this more sense of and more deeper reflection on the global capitalism, and also deeper ability to reflect and critical on how the positive sense making can also empowering us. So along that line, I think I also would like to accept that the issue of the limits of the nation state as identity reference, and we really need to overcome it, surmounting this by not just unreal experience, but more of this solidarity in the sense of disaster in the making that we are experiencing. So along that, I think the whether we, if I mentioned that some people in the physics, some people talk about centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. If you, along the kind of feeling I got when CECEñA talked, I was thinking about some discussion by Amitai Etioni, who talk about this, how we can balance ourselves in the world of centrifugal forces and centripetal forces, how society can deal with capitalism, so to speak, global capitalism, which also can be disintegrating forces, feeling, and also can bring us even more in other way, more inward, rotating around a center of being humble enough as humanity. So that is a centripetal forces, bringing us a bit more to the center, not outward, not separating each other. So integrating or disintegrating humanity is a real challenge of our time. I think it is very immediate as well how to see this. And I think my last point would relate to a bit more how can we, with the feeling, with the sense of solidarity and ethical solidarity in the context of even more increasing gaps within and across our units. I would like to highlight the experiences of, we are still having a lot of post-COVID mega projects coming up. Now people talk about this stimulus package, but the stimulus package we are talking now, a lot of mainstream discussion goes in the context of still the growth-oriented, and those discussions are so much related to the old normal, although they talk a lot about new normal. But the central issue of livelihoods, the central issue of health, the central issues of, in fact, human and the biodiversity systems, the socio-economic system human have made in the context of biodiversity loss and distinction have not been in the picture. So I would like to highlight and bring this feeling to a new stage of our possibility of thinking together. I am very much interested to try to see beyond, like a subnational networking across borders, not just talking to each other in terms of the capital center, but that is necessary, but not enough. I think in terms of a more making sense of this in terms of bringing us to a more basics of life and death, and how the meaning of life and death is a part of our own being in the earth like this. So in that sense, I think we are all in the same planet, where we even need more how in the words of MUSHAKOJI, bioregion. Using the word bioregion, I would talk around here. I would like to talk about the Mekong subregion, for example. The Mekong subregion, one of the longest river of our region. In fact, we have not been able to engage with the bioregional context of our problematization that much. So I would like to push ahead along the line that several friends have talked about, how can we bring the commons, biodiversity commons, which are the source of life and our possibilities to engage into our picture. And along that line, the immediate future about the global commons of cyber, the digital commons, how we are now at the moment, at this minute, we are using the digital commons more as a part of our possibility. So how to bring the global commons into our thinking of reorienting and also empowering our exchange. So talking about the continents, we even need to bring this real experience from the global university, global, our efforts today, SSFS7 as a intercontinental. So bringing this inter-bioregional sense always is a condition for our own humble but also a cross-border identity formation. So with this, I think the longer view, a deeper reflection and critical, yet also see the value of being creative along the line that our friends, our respected friends have been doing. I really feel honored to be a part of this and would like to see more of and I would like to be a part of these efforts, even using the digital as a part of more exchange along this, how to bring our positive sense into a more empowering work. And I have benefited a lot from the writings of friends, and along that line, I would like to see how we can move ahead again. So thank you very much.
And now we will go over to Ecuador, to where Victor Hugo Hihon is. And I think now it's almost, well, it's 10:30 in the evening for you. And Victor Hugo, he formerly studied in the French Petroleum Institute and had been engaged in various hydrocarbons research in France, Algeria, Ecuador, and other countries. He has been doing planning work of sustainable development and energy transition, and he has also been engaged in solidarity activities to promote human rights. He is currently the national coordinator of the Committee for the Defense of Human Rights, and he's the former coordinator of the Latin American Network of Human Rights Education, as well as the Council of Adult Education in Latin America. So now, Victor Hugo, over to you.
First of all, I want to thank Kinhide's kind invitation to participate as a discutant in this important forum. I always remember with joy your visit to Ecuador a few years ago and the very illustrative activities of social and organizational promotion that we carry out with various social, indigenous, and peasant organizations. Likewise, my fraternal greeting to Lai Seung-yong, who in other occasions was also in Quito participating in university academic forums. I'm very happy also to see Firoze MANJI and Esther CECEñA from Quito. The content and proposal of the speakers have shown us the complexity of the issues under discussion, reflected in the diversity of the themes and acts of analysis, and above all, in the conflict that globalization entails. Indeed, from its historical origins to the conquest and colonization of Abya Yala, renamed after America, globalization has various dimensions, including economic, military, social, and cultural, among others. The process involves an increasingly significant control of production, the labor process, and the flow of wealth on a world scale, and at the same time shows a more concentrated and centralized level of capital appropriation of world labor surplus value. A picture of globalization, which is in these main lines fairly well known, a process led by transnational corporations in order to maximize their profits, all favored by international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund of the World Bank, and the states that privatize the commons at will. The consequences are also well known: poverty, destruction of local cultures, wars, disruption of ecosystems, etc. 8% of world trade is explained as trade between transnational corporations. 48% of the social wealth produced in the economy of transnational corporations is based in the tax havens, London, Delaware, Hong Kong. Therefore, it is invisible in the eyes of the states. What said about globalization and overexploitation of the workforce? The fall of the Soviet Union opens the way in 1991 to the launch of the European Union and the rise in the orbit of the global financial capital economy as a new form of dominant capital that operates without borders. Until 1980, the labor market operated mostly within the limits of national borders. Since the end of the 20th century, there has been the creation of a world labor market. The world's economically active populations went from 1.9 billion in 1998 to 3.1 billion in 26, representing an increase of 63%. Almost all of this quantitative growth has occurred in the emerging nations, which now house 84% of the global workforce. In essence, the globalization of the world labor market means a greater capacity for replacement of the labor force in the entire world. This implies job instability, a worldwide downward trend in wages, an increase in the working day, and a worsening in working conditions, and this throughout the world. With globalization, formal democracy itself as a model of representations has lost credibility. There is no longer a national project and therefore fewer and fewer commitments to citizens themselves. The big parties and traditional bipartisanships are in crisis. New political forces are born as fragmentation of the big parties, and they all have in common the slogan against globalization. Globalization has created a heterogeneous world of work made up of fewer and fewer formalized workers and a growing army of different modes of informality and in different social situations, typical of the popular subsistence economy. What can we say about the possible alternatives? In Kinh's invitation to the panelists, there were two essential questions. One, there are many critical analyses of the problems, but how about alternatives that to work and alternatives that we pursued at the global, regional, national, local levels, such as finance, economy, decolonization, the growth? How would you comment on the strength and the weakness of less progressive intellectuals? About the first question, in July 2013, China and the BRICS took position and launched the new alternative financial architecture to the dollar. BRICS represent 45% of the world population, 25% of the world GDP, and 41% of the world's foreign exchange reserve. Its intra-block trade accounts for 17 of world trade. The new Silk Road or One Belt, One Road project is launched in 2014. The project integrated 60 countries, 75% of the world's known energy reserves, 70% of the world population, and will generate 55% of world GDP. The new Silk Road is configured as a trade and production project to motorize trade and production in the world, but also as a major geopolitical project. The development of this initiative represents the emergence of a project of a new world order, which would end the hegemony of the United States as a nation-state of central country and unipolar central power, to give rise to a new world interconnected through multiple sovereign powers. About the second question, seen from the perspective of those who want to create a different social order in Latin America, the current process controlled by the corporation of capitalist globalization must be urgently replaced by what Samir Amin in 21 called a new system of regulated multipolar globalization. This form of alternative globalization requires the creation of regional economical and political unions in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. According to Amin, this regional union of states are necessary to work together in the task of collectively regulation, the global restructuring of the world economy for the benefits of the vast majority of humanity, breaking with the current system of exploitation and inequality. They need to redirect and restructure their economy to meet the needs of the majority of its inhabitants and, at the same time, protect their natural resources. Of course, this requires, in the first place, work from below. Science, civil society, organizations, and social movements pressure governments in the region to adopt a new model without the interference and threat of the free trade agreements that Washington has negotiated with Chile, Colombia, Peru, the countries of Central America, and the Dominican Republic. These treaties compromise national sovereignty, hamper local drug production, enable the for-profit privatization of water and other vital services such as health, and threaten the survival of indigenous cultures, biodiversity, food sovereignty, and local control of natural resources. This is a huge challenge for the multiplication of networks, organizations, and social movements that articulate and promote political representation to participate in electoral process and access the government with anti-neoliberal policies that reconfigure the state democratically with full citizens' participation in the decision-making bodies of public institutions as a kind of co-government in the implementation of economic and social policies that point to another development, where sustainability, food sovereignty, nature preservation, social justice, equity, gender, and intergenerational are the major objectives of the emancipatory struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor Hugo. Well, before we go back to the six speakers for their brief comments, well, we are of course already running over time, but would any of you would want to speak? Maybe.
Thank you so much for the invitation. As you see, my niece has to help me because technology so advanced, I cannot follow it. I would advance then something I have thought to say in my intervention, but I think it's appropriate to say it today. Actually, I accept the term of globalization because there's no way of avoiding it. But it's a very misleading wording for what is going on in the world. That's his first. Second, personally, for me, it's very difficult, almost impossible, to talk about globalization without talking about imperialism. Therefore, I agree with some of the colleagues that had spoken already before, that had treated globalization always in connection with imperialism. In today's world, for me, it is almost impossible, because the big problem for me of globalization is that it's an imperialistic globalization. So only through great struggle throughout the world towards emancipation of human beings, and also changing the relationship between countries, regions, and human beings, we can foresee and create through a struggle, great struggle, systematic, with consciousness, for a new world and new system. And then maybe I say, we could have a globalization linked to emancipation and not to the dominance or the hegemony, in cultural term hegemony, but in terms of economics and political imperialism always try to dominate. So in that situation, we cannot have a justice with that globalization. So it's a struggle against in a specific kind of globalization linked to imperialism, and therefore a big, enormous struggle, systematic, relentlessly against imperialism. This is my point of view, essentially.
Thank you, Isabel. We'll be hearing more from you in the last session of the 9 sessions. So, is there any question? So maybe, I think since we are running out of time, and actually in the afternoon session, in the next session, we are dealing with the same topic. And also we have our friends from Russia, Turkey, Greece, Indonesia, Japan, Philippines, Venezuela, and China joining us in the next panel on the same theme. So maybe I think some of you could, if you have questions, you could post later on. So can I go back to all our 6 speakers? Initially, we planned that we would be speaking 8 minutes each, but I think that would be a bit too long. So maybe if you could keep your comments to about 5 minutes, and then, so may I invite JOMO first?
Thank you very much, Kinchi. Sorry about the delay. Allow me to make 3 points in response. I very much appreciate the spirit of the last intervention by Compañera Isabella from Cuba, who reminds us about the need to understand globalization in relation to imperialism, but at the same time, she does not equate the two. And this, I think, is a very, very important distinction which she makes. But let me respond also to Hilmar FARID's very important intervention. I think the importance of his intervention is to emphasize the need to draw from our own cultural resources for the legitimacy of our projects. And this is why I think the idea of drawing from the notion of salam, which has so many different dimensions, becomes important. I would simply emphasize that he quoted Ibn Khaldun, the great historian. Khaldun also reminds us that the idea of a quarantine in dealing with a plague actually began when the ships from Istanbul visited Venice, and the Doge of Venice was trying to understand how they avoided the spread of the plague, and the idea of arba'in, the use of a 40-day limitation on visitors, was subsequently translated into Italian as quaranta, and quaranta became quarantina, and we know it in English as quarantine. So it's very, very important, I think, for us to draw on our cultural resources, especially when so much of our discourse, our contemporary discourse, seems to draw from a particular shared, seemingly universal discourse, but it is essentially a North Atlantic discourse. And this is why I think it is very important for us to draw on our own cultural resources and to remind ourselves in dealing with COVID-19, for example, how the rest of the world has suffered by not learning from the fact that East avoided very, very lockdowns precisely by early precautionary measures. And so you do not have lockdowns in most countries. In fact, even in China, outside of the 3 provinces around Wuhan, there was no lockdown on a national scale. And this is very important because early actions there, as well as in Kerala, where you had a left progressive government, they were very, very successful in containing the problem of contagion, even though the first case of in India of COVID-19 was actually in Kerala. They were very successful in organizing this. And this relates, of course, to the question of who is most adversely affected. And we find that it is precisely the informal sector in many of our economies, and the informal sector is huge in many developing countries. And so these are the people who have been most affected by lockdown measures, which have been adopted very often by imitating what has been happening in the West. The second point I'd like to make is to simply endorse what Ana Esther CECEñA reminded us. I think it is very important for us to recognize that there was, before all this current talk about Paris and before that Copenhagen, that there was actually an agreement made, an agreement which the US refused to accept, an agreement which was called the Kyoto Protocol. And that Kyoto Protocol was basically to restrict, but unfortunately, not only the US, but even the European and Japan who signed on to the Kyoto Protocol have not adhered to the Kyoto Protocol in terms of restricting the carbon emissions. And so we have a very, very serious problem. This is especially important because right now we see the attacks on multilateralism, the attacks on negotiations on many, many fronts. And we have to begin to deal with this. This is an attack coming in the name of nationalism, coming in the name and this is extremely important for us to recognize that ethno-populism has also mobilized in the name of nationalism, sometimes hinting at anti-imperialism against a multilateral system and so on and so forth. So, when we think about the of climate, the threat is very much like the frog in the boiling water. The water is slowly getting hotter and hotter, and the frog will eventually die. But there is no clear line where you cross over, and precisely because of that, there is inaction and the failure of collective action due to which is now worse because of the breakdown of multilateralism. The last point I would like to make is in response to Katherine Gibson. She talks about degrowth. I'm sorry, I have to disagree with the idea of prioritizing degrowth, because in so many poor countries, in many developing countries, there is no way of improving the conditions for the vast majority of the people, except through developing the productive forces and ensuring, this is key, the redistribution of the output, and so on and so forth. So how do we do that? And I think it's very important for us to remind ourselves that a century ago, when people were talking about the new international, a century ago, there was a recognition that in the West, you might have a movement towards socialism in the industrial countries of that time. But for the rest of the world, the struggle was essentially national and democratic. And it's important for us to recognize that what was meant by national was precisely the struggle against imperialism at that time. So we have to reappropriate the struggle against imperialism. We have to reappropriate the national tradition, and not to be jingoistic, not to be narrow national chauvinist, but to recognize that what is appropriate for our times is often will involve progressive coalitions which will not necessarily and may not envisage an immediate movement towards socialism. What has been achieved, of course, in places like Cuba and so on, is exemplary and inspiring in terms of what has happened, in terms of the solidarity shown in the face of COVID-19. But we have to, so we're not talking about reversing that, but in so many other places, we have seen reversals. We have seen reversals, and let us face it, what we are seeing in East Asia, in economies which are supposedly socialist economies, is basically a different type of capitalism. A capitalism with, you can call it capitalism with Chinese characteristics or capitalism with Vietnamese characteristics. But what we are seeing now is a struggle over the future of capitalism itself. And this is the dominant system in the world today. And so the question now is how do we deal with this reality, and the deal with and how do we build in a situation where you have two versions of the right. On the one hand, the neoliberals, and on the other hand, the jingoistic ethno-populists. And this is the choice which we face before us today. In a sense, it's a very difficult choice, because in the past it was a very simple between, socialism and barbarism, if you will, or something like that. But today the choice is much, much more difficult, and we have to rethink what is the challenges before us. I think I'm taking too much time, Kinchi. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, JOMO. Well, I'm reading your newsletters every week, and I would also recommend all the participants to go to the websites and then read what JOMO has to say about many different economic and also sociological issues. Now, I would like to invite Musha.
Give you an example of what I believe is what we should look at. There is an idea that context-free human rights are very important, and this is quite true, but context dependence is also important for each of the identity community to be able to have, like Samir Amin mentioned, to have a self-reliance, a collective self-reliance. The unit of the collective self-reliance is the source of not free, but rather a dependent, context-dependent idea. And there is in Syria, in the border of Turkey, there is the West Kurdistan free autonomous region, called Rojava. And in Rojava, it is very important. It is Kurdistan. It is a Kurdistan free zone. But it is a Kurdistan, but the leader of Rojava, Kurdistan, was Abdullah Öcalan, and Abdullah Öcalan has been influenced by Bakhtin, Murray Bakhtin, an American anarchist. And so Öcalan organized the Free State of Rojava, first with the equality between gender. So for each of the important role, there is always a man and a woman who are jointly the mayor or mayor and vice mayor, that kind of arrangement. And the other thing is that they have 3 counties, and in each of the county they have a parliamentary system, and in the parliamentary system they don't have a majority decision. All decisions have to be made by the acceptance of all the religious, ethnic, cultural minorities which are in Rojava. So it is a Kurd free zone, but the free zone is accepting only unanimous agreement among all the ethnic groups in Rojava. And so they have, in that way, the it is Kurd, it is part of Kurdistan, but the content, all the minorities are respected. So there is a context-dependent zone, but in the context-dependent zone, there is an agreement so that there is context-free human rights are all accepted. And this is the kind of situation which I think is the only way to fight against imperialism. And this is the way to have the Samir Amin collective self-reliance on the basis of overlapping communities. So I would like to mention that we have to look into that kind of context-dependent system where context-independent human rights can be implemented. It's not have to have first independent, context-independent human rights and accept other things, but rather to start with a context-dependent traditional values and everything existing there has to be taken into account, and then and only then you go into human rights. This is what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Musha. And Musha mentioned the question of gender, and I remember Musha playing guitar and singing his song, Going to the Gender Equity Land. Okay. So maybe at some other point, we will hear you sing again. So now I would like to hand over the floor to Huang Ping, Professor Huang.
Thank you again. After listening to other speakers, commentators, in this maybe 3 minutes, I'd like to add one, if possible, 3 more points. First, I shared and also fully agree, if we discuss the issue, phenomena, problem, challenge of globalization, we need to fully recognize the history of imperialism, early capitalism, colonialism, and the neoliberal order during after the Cold War. Second, I also shared the very point that the development should be not only sustainable, but not only economic dimension, say the growth, but rather we need to look at the quality of life, level of solidarity, etc., etc. And even actually some even 3 decades ago, I remember, I'm not wrong, the UNDP tried to introduce non-economic dimension and indicators. The UNDP say one is life expectancy, second is level of literacy. But the problem for these human development indicators, for me, is still is very based on the individual level, not the community level. So therefore, now for us, for me, for our, based on our past experiences, research, and also the current challenges, including this pandemic, COVID-19 virus, shows how important the dimension, therefore indicators, measurement of the development as well as the globalization must be first, not just one-dimensional, say, economic. Second, not just individual, but rather this how important the community. Therefore, the community can be or should not be only the rural or poor or traditional, but for a new community, new identities, this new must be inclusive, as I have already said, but taking the experiences of current anti-pandemic COVID-19 virus, several observations I have seen, I'd like to share with you, are important, but each of them is more community-based practice rather than individual. One is a level of coordination between public sectors, economic, health, and many others. Second is a community building and how individuals in those communities actually behave themselves and also work with communities. Third is the existing but the quality of the public health system and the actual access to such public health system for the ordinary people, for those community members, no matter they have so-called economic resources or not. Next one is how, to what extent the community, including its members, can, in the first time and in every daily based, to be informed about very practical knowledge, take knowledge, how to prevent themselves to be infected. This are, of course, we can continue, but all of this shows it's not just individual-based approach to either the new tech globalization or alternative development or community regeneration. But it shows we need to work out at this during this crisis and in order to deal with this crisis. And one of the very realistic, already existing, which was not the case in the first, second, even third waves of the globalization, is technology, especially the technology for communication, IT, which is also the case for our forum. This was the first time that very ordinary people in very remote areas, people either minorities or so-called poor communities, actually can interconnected together. That's one of the bases for us to think of, to imagine the new community, new or alternative to the globalization, or go beyond the previous ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So now, Hilmar, so please. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Kinshi. There are 3 points that I'd like to make. First is a response to Surichai's idea of the commons, which I think is a very important concept. As we know in history, the agricultural commons, and today there is a lot of discussion about digital commons as well. Of course, it's not new. And in fact, it was part of the pre-capitalist and pre-colonial systems. It is a central concept in most indigenous communities that helped them to survive over centuries and also to overcome social divisions. So bringing in the idea of common today reminds us that the history of capitalism is in fact the history of the enclosure of the commons. Going back to the 16th century England, from land enclosure and so on to the enclosure of knowledge today. So the idea of common, I think, can be very useful as a unifying principle, organizing principle, which will help to bind progressive thinking and actions. And I think it's also an important concept on which imagination of the future should be based. And the mini conference that I mentioned before, and Kinshi was also presenting there, some of the speakers actually talk about commonism as an important political category. And I think this is an idea that we can elaborate and along our thinking about future alternatives. The second one is about geography. And I think it's really time now to carefully map out progressive movements, from grassroots initiatives to more established organizations of workers, farmers, fisherfolk, progressive digital activism, and so on. And really to think about how these movements can get together. And of course, we need a narrative, to bind this progressive energy together and create new, I think, geographical imagination. MUSHAKOJI Sensei has mentioned the Silk Road. In Indonesia, in the last few years, we have been promoting the Spice Route and focusing on pre-colonial connections from Papua to the eastern coast of Africa. And I think we need to continue this discussion to come up with an alternative vision of our global world. And the last thing is about urgency. our discussions, we've been trying to consolidate our ranks, connect movements across continents and so on. And we also know the problems and challenges in doing that. But in this context, I just want to underline the urgency of our situation. Change for the better is not a question of choice. It's a question of necessity. So let's us get together and really build a better world in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilmar. So Anna?
Let me read you a quote from James Baldwin. He once outlined that the rulers of the higher races, in inverted commas, quote, struggling to hold on to what they have stolen from their captives and unable to look into their mirror, will precipitate a chaos throughout the world, which, if it does not bring life on this planet to an end, will bring about a racial war such as the world has never seen. And the second point is just a short poem I'd like to read to you. The law locks up the man and woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack until they go and steal it back. Thank you.
Thank you, Firoze. That's a beautiful end to our session. And I would like to remind you that well, we are coming back in 2 hours to the next session where we deal with the same theme. And then this evening in Hong Kong time and morning in the Americas, we are going to have this dialogue between Wen Tie-jun and Michael Hudson. And actually, this dialogue has started some time ago. So we already have 5 different contributions. So please go to the reader under the South Forum 7, and you can see the dialogue already unfolding. And then that is how we can be invigorating more debates. And I thank you again for coming here, attending the forum, because the main idea is that we will interact with each other, read each other, and also share. Apart from sharing solidarities, we could be working on alternative practices. So thank you all again, and thank you to our interpreters who have been doing this wonderful job. So see you again in 2 hours. Bye.